World War II gave us a lot of tough warships. Take the near indomitable battleship Bismarck, for example, which took over 400 shells and 3 torpedoes before she started to succumb to the waves, or the Japanese battleship Yamato, which absorbed 6 bomb strikes and 11 torpedoes before she met the same fate. But from the register of the resilience that is World War II battleships, there is one that stands above all the rest, and that would be the USS Enterprise. Outwardly just another American aircraft carrier, she was in actuality an absolute unit of a ship, one that took not only an absolute hammering, repeatedly in fact, and stayed afloat, but it gave out as good as it got. So much action did she see, in fact, that come the end of World War II, she was the most decorated American warship of the entire conflict, bar none. And today we're going to be finding out just what she was all about, so let's begin. Enterprise was not an only child, being but one of the Yorktown class of carriers alongside her sisters Hornet and the lead ship Yorktown. Their construction was quite the long-lived process, lasting from 1934 through to 1941, despite only being a class of 3. As for Enterprise herself, she was the middle child of the brood, with her construction beginning in 1934, her launch occurring in 1936, and her final commissioning happening in 1938. And don't worry, we didn't get our years wrong there, despite them sounding a bit weird. Both Enterprise and Yorktown began construction in 1934, but they didn't get started on Hornet until 1939 for political reasons. Just don't worry about it, it's not important. As for Enterprise specifically, however, she was quite the dainty thing compared to many of her fleet carrier contemporaries, measuring 247 meters long at her furthest points and 232 meters at the waterline, as well as being 33 meters wide at her broadest and 25 meters at the waterline. These rather slender measurements naturally gave her a modest displacement, with her usually coming in at 18,000 tons with a standard load, or 23,000 tons if they really went to town stuffing her full. And do note that's metric tons we're using here. As for our claim that all of that made her quite small, consider that a British Illustrious class typically displaced 23,000 tons with a normal load, and an American Essex class came in at 31,000 tons, again with a standard load, and you begin to get the idea. This was because Enterprise was a so-called treaty-era ship, i.e. one which had been built with dimensions that would not violate the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty. Signed by the UK, the US, France, Italy, and Japan, it placed major limits on what these signatory powers could build, with the US specifically being limited to a gross displacement of 137,000 tons across all of their aircraft carriers, with no individual one being allowed to displace more than 24,000 tons, although they were allowed to convert 2 existing capital ship hulls and up their displacement to 30,000 tons. Since Enterprise was not one of those conversions, however, she was never going to be more than 24,000 tons, with the US Navy opting to go ever so smaller still so they could squeeze another whole ship out of their limit, which was the USS Wasp, if you were interested. Oh, and if you happen to be wondering what's the deal with the Essex class in that case, the treaty was naturally torn up as the world ratcheted closer to war, and they were built after that date. Easy peasy. As for the rest of Enterprise's design, thanks to her lightness, as well as having a sleek and hydrodynamic hull and a whopping 120,000 shaft horsepower thanks to the 4 Parsons geared steam turbines engines buried deep within her, she was reasonably brisk, being able to top out at 60 kilometers per hour or so. But then we get to the real meat of the matter, namely her aircraft. The exact number that she carried varied at any given time, both intentionally, with her complement sometimes being messed about with in anticipation of a specific mission, and unintentionally due to some either being shot down or dumped into the drink during duff landings. By her design, however, she had space for up to 96, all of which were crammed into a single 199-meter-long hangar bay. And to make sure that she could get them all up in the air with all due haste, she was outfitted with 3 separate aircraft elevators, each 15 by 13 meters and able to shift up to 7,700 kilos. That's more than enough for anything that could fit in a hangar. The specific aircraft that would be going up said lifts varied greatly over the years, however, as during the very same years that Enterprise was afloat, aviation technology was going through some major changes. For example, a surviving report from June 1938, i.e. from Enterprise's early years, documents that she had 81 aircraft aboard in total, a figure that comprised 21 Curtiss SBC dive bombers, a further 21 Douglas TBD torpedo bombers, 20 Grumman F-3F fighters, 13 Northrop BT dive bombers, 4 Vought O-2U scouts, and 2 Grumman J-2F utility aircraft. Come September 1944, however, this had changed to 53 total aircraft, among which could be counted 37 Grumman F-6F fighters and 16 Grumman TBF torpedo bombers. See what we mean about how, despite having an on-paper capacity of 96 aircraft, the actual number varied a lot. And also, the sophistication of the aircraft she carried changed over time. You'll note that there weren't any biplanes in that second roster. Oh, and if you happen to be wondering exactly why a complement was so low on the second list, that would be because on the 14th of May 1945, she suffered an absolutely horrific kamikaze attack, one in which an Imperial Japanese Navy pilot by the name of Lieutenant Sansuke Tomoyasu crashed an obsolete Mitsubishi A5M laden with explosives into her at a speed of over 480 kilometers per hour, which, between the force of the impact, the size of the explosion, the raging fire that started as a result, completely obliterated the forward section of her hangar. We bring this up not just to add context to our last point, but also because it gives us an excuse to show this photo, which was captured mere seconds after Tomoyasu impacted Enterprise. And do you see that little thing at the crest of the fireball? That isn't muck on the camera. That's Enterprise's forward elevator being thrown 120 meters into the air by the force of the blast. This also segues us nicely into discussing her armored deck, because while it certainly wasn't happy about being subjected to the force of the Tomiyasu's blast, it did hold solid and remained intact. It's actually quite surprising too, all things considered, as the 38mm of armor plating that she had immediately underneath her wooden deck was actually considered to be quite weak at the time, with a proper big boy armored deck having been omitted in order to save weight and keep her tonnage down. Compare this with the HMS Illustrious, as the British really liked themselves an armoured deck, and you'll see what we mean, as she had 76mm of plating, which is double the Enterprise's. The rest of Enterprise's armour was much the same, often lighter than many of her contemporaries, but not so light that it became a problem. We won't stress too much about the rest of her exact thickness, however, for the fact that due to having different thickness all over the place, it would take absolutely ages and would probably bore you to death, and I appreciate your watch time. We've given one exact measurement and the general idea, so that'll do for today. What we will say, however, is that actually, in some regards, her lighter armor could actually be considered a major bonus, mostly for the fact that it freed up considerable internal space for aircraft. We've already said that she was designed to carry up to 96 of them, but what we haven't said is that this was actually quite a lot for her day, especially for a carrier of her size. Consider HMS Illustrious again, which we already know placed a major emphasis on armor protection. She carried a typical complement of 36 aircraft and could really squeeze in 57 if they really packed them in tight. See what I mean? So spacious was Enterprise, in fact, that even the Yorktown class's replacement, the Essex class that we discussed earlier on, only carried roughly the same complement of aircraft, and that was despite displacing 31,000 tons with a standard load, not far off double the Enterprise. Despite her cracking complement, however, the US Navy was under no illusions to the fact that Enterprise's comparatively light armor could well prove to be her undoing. They had intended for her air wing to be her primary means of defense, but just to be really safe, they also fitted her with a staggering array of anti-aircraft guns. The amount bolted to her continually grew as the war went on, and come the end of the war, it was recorded as including 8 127mm Mark 12 guns, the same ones that were on some destroyers' main armament, 32 20mm Oerlikon cannons, and last but not least, 54 40mm Bofors autocannons. Oh yeah, safe to say that she could chuck a crazy amount of lead up into the sky to defend herself, although as Lieutenant Tomoyasu proved earlier, this still wasn't always enough to do the job. The final point of her design to consider is that while a touch on the petite side, Enterprise was absolutely bristling with the latest and greatest supplementary technology. The bigger guns that we just discussed, for example, were eventually all hooked up to the Mark 37 fire control system, an incredibly advanced thing that used a radar system to control gun targeting. With this, it still took an average of 1,000 rounds from the Mark 12s to bring down an attacking aircraft, but believe it or not, this was actually very, very good for the time. Then there was Enterprise's proper radar set, the one that it used for detecting and tracking the movements of enemy units, both on the waves and in the sky. The first such system that she was fitted with was the CXAM-1 in 1940, which, while heavily dependent upon environmental factors during its operation, gave Enterprise a set of eyes out to nearly as far as 160 kilometers according to some sources. Now, this was a big deal when you consider that many of World War II's combatants simply never developed naval radar, period. Eventually, though, however groundbreaking the CXAM was, it was replaced with even better systems like the SM Fighter Direction Radar and SK Air Search Radar, both of them more specialized and effective sets. So then, Having heard all of that, perhaps you now aren't too surprised that Enterprise performed so ridiculously well during the war. Luck was part of it, of course, as it always is in war, but the simple facts of the matter are that despite her imperfections, she was simply a phenomenally designed and built vessel. But what of the specifics of said performance? What were the highs? What were the lows? The moments of triumph? The moments of disaster? And ultimately, what happened to her? Well, let's answer those questions, shall we? If you twisted our arms behind our backs and forced us to pick out a single word that encapsulates Enterprise's service, it would probably be perennial. Pick up any decent history of the Pacific War, and as you flick through its pages, you will start to gain the impression that she is referenced on basically every page. You would get this impression for good reason too, because given the fact that she took part in nearly every major naval engagement of the theater, it's not exactly a surprise that she's on every page. She was actually one of the first American vessels of the war to see combat, voluntarily anyway, as the likes of the USS Arizona and Oklahoma, stationed at Pearl Harbor as they were on the 7th of December 1941, weren't exactly given a choice in the matter. Enterprise, however, she was not at Pearl Harbor on that fateful day. Instead, she was a little over 200 miles away, having been delivering aircraft to the American base at Wake Island. As desperate messages of the chaos unfolding reached her, she immediately made for home at max power. She didn't do much, however, as despite only being 320 kilometers away, the attack had long since ended by the time she was close enough for her aircraft to be in range. She did put 30 aircraft into the sky to attack a Japanese carrier that was reported as being southwest of her, but unfortunately the intelligence that led to that order proved to be hokum, so they returned to base with both magazines and bomb racks still a-brimming. Despite that disappointing start, however, things quickly improved for Enterprise as, not even 3 days later, she was back out at sea, having been refueled and resupplied in record time, and proceeded to bag herself the first Japanese fleet submarine kill of the war when she took out I-70. She then spent the rest of 1941 conducting a series of rather dull and uneventful patrols, nothing too exciting. Fast forward to 1942 then, and she found herself back in the action. Things started off slow at first, with her taking part in a raid against the Marshall Islands in February. The results of this proved somewhat lackluster, however, sinking a small gunboat and damaging but not sinking the light cruiser Katori, as well as a few smaller vessels. Come June, however, that's when things would really start to kick into gear, and Enterprise's legend would start to form, as that is when she took part in the Battle of Midway. It proved to be a family affair too, as both Yorktown and Hornet went with her, making the entire American carrier force of the battle between them. Now, we won't worry too much about the specifics of the wider battle, as we really don't have time to get into all of the nitty-gritty details, but we will concern ourselves with Enterprise's antics therein. Her crowning achievement, by far, was sinking the carrier Kaga, with it being her Douglas SBD dive bombers that scored direct hits with 1,140 kilos worth of bombs that demolished her rear elevator, blew her bridge clean off, and after penetrating her upper hangar, set off a chain reaction of 36,000 kilos of stored bombs that utterly gutted her innards. This completely put Kaga out of the fight, and a little over 9 hours later, she was scuttled by her own crew as they abandoned ship. She also had a hand in sinking the Akagi and the Hiryu, though these are commonly ascribed as group efforts rather than the glory being given to any one Yorktown class in particular. Enterprise came through all of that, having suffered essentially no damage at all, unlike Yorktown, which was lost along with 141 of her crew. From there, it was over to Guadalcanal, as in August she supported amphibious landings on the island. There, she became the target of relentless Japanese air attacks. Much of these she saw off no problem thanks to her vast array of anti-aircraft weaponry and comprehensive area alarm, but on the 24th of August, while fighting in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, her luck faltered, and she took the first real damage of her career, with a total of 3 direct hits and 4 near misses, killing 74 of her crew, wounding a further 95 and inflicting serious damage. Not damage serious enough to sink her, however, and so she limped back to Pearl Harbor, where she was patched up from mid-September through to mid-October. She then proceeded to take another absolute battering, because not even a month after all of that repair work was completed, she found herself participating in the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands in late October. There she was hit by 2 bombs, which killed 44 sailors and wounded 75 more, as well as seriously damaging her once again. She stayed afloat, luckily, but found herself the last Yorktown class atop the waves as Hornet, which suffered a total of 3 bomb strikes and an equal number of torpedo hits, sank before the battle was finished, taking 150 of her crew with her. Lady Luck started to once again favor Enterprise, however, because after returning for repairs not even a month after the last lot had been completed, she soon found herself back out at sea and adding a very impressive ship to her kill list, the WWII. This was the first Japanese battleship sunk during the war. It happened during the November 1942 naval battle of Guadalcanal and was very much a team effort. Army Air Force B-17s also played a big part in the sinking. All in all, WWII was sent to the ocean bed by a combination of between 5 and 8 torpedo hits, as well as up to 8 bomb hits, and while the exact quantity of ordnance that did the job may be unclear, what we do know is that of however many torpedoes hit, 3 of them were from Enterprise's torpedo bombers. And all of that was just in the first year of her war service. Starting to see why Enterprise has such a reputation? Unfortunately, once again, we just don't have the time today to give you a full history of her war service. It was so large and she did so much stuff that even to do it as a simplistic bullet point list would be all but impossible. Fortunately, however, focusing on just the first year of her war service is more than enough for our purposes today, as that also just so happens to be the most action-packed bit. It's not like we could even just focus on ships she sank, because when all was said and done, on the 2nd of September 1945, Enterprise had sunk 71 of them and damaged or destroyed 192 more, and we just don't have time to cover all of those. Oh, and for how many planes she shot down, that number would be 911 between her aerial wing and AA guns. It's no surprise then that Enterprise holds the record as the most decorated US Navy ship of World War II, and as for what specific decorations that includes, that would be 20 battle stars, each one of which signifies a battle she took part in. This is also more than any other ship of the war, a Presidential Unit Citation which is awarded only to units that have displayed exceptional and repeated gallantry under enemy fire. She was awarded it in May 1943, specifically for her actions from December 1941 through to November 1942, the very period we focused on in this chapter. And last, but no means least, she also has a Navy Unit Commendation, which is, in practical terms, essentially the same kind of thing as the Presidential Unit Citation, just awarded by the Secretary of the Navy rather than the President. So then, what became of the Enterprise after her great and gallant war service? Well, firstly, she was patched up, as she was still reeling from Lieutenant Tomiyasu's Kamikaze attack, and then she set about assisting Operation Magic Carpet, the enormous effort to repatriate millions upon millions of American servicemen back home following the cessation of hostilities. Enterprise was naturally the ideal kind of ship for such a task, thanks to the whopping great empty space that was her hangar bay, and so over 10,000 servicemen would end up squeezing within her over the course of several voyages. And that was about it, to be honest. Enterprise had been absolutely top of the line back when she hit the waves, but naval technology had come a long way during the war years, and now 1938 seemed like ever such a long time ago. There was no two ways about it. A trooper she might have been, but she was now essentially archaic. And worse still, thanks to the wind down in military spending and consequential reduction in the size of the Navy following Japan's surrender, there wasn't even an argument to be made for mothballing her and keeping her on ice just in case things got a bit lively with the Soviets. The 24 plus more advanced carriers made during the war would be enough to tide the Navy over, and so Enterprise was formally decommissioned in February 1947. Given her incredible record, however, some monumental efforts were made to try and preserve her as a memorial and museum by many different groups of people, but these ultimately came to naught, and so she was finally sent to the scrapman in July 1958. 2 years later, the work was finished, and she was gone. Today, only mere echoes of the once indomitable ship remain, the odd fitting or fixture that was smuggled out of the scrapyard upper worker's jumper, the occasional trinket kept by someone who served on her, and most notably of all, her sternplate, which was very intentionally saved and today sits in the small town of Rivervale in New Jersey. But otherwise, that's it. And so the story of the Enterprise, and this video along with it, come to their end.